Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
When my sister announced her engagement, Dad pulled me aside and said, "Don't mention anything that could overshadow this," and I nodded like the obedient version of myself he still thinks exists, telling him I understood, and that tonight was her night. Even though a part of me rolled its eyes so hard I could have sprained them, because I have heard that same line in different costumes my whole life, every time there was a moment that was supposed to be hers, or a test I scored well on, or a job I landed, or a milestone I reached that had to be handled carefully and quietly so it didn't make her feel smaller. I told myself I would keep it calm and polite, that I would play the role and do the smile and say the supportive sister things everyone expects from me, because I know how these family ceremonies work and I know the choreography by heart, where my job is to clap and compliment and never make too much noise, and if there is anything awkward floating around, I am supposed to absorb it like a sponge and pretend it was never there, while other people get to speak loudly about their victories and act as if the room was built to echo only their names. It is not that my sister, whose name is Jenna, is a monster or that she wakes up every day planning to step on me. It is more that she understands, with an instinct that looks like muscle memory, that our parents have always treated her like a fragile glass ornament that must be displayed at eye level with the right lighting and no fingerprints, while I am the workhorse who can carry the heavy box up the stairs without complaining. Which means that when something must be protected, it is her. And when something must be hidden, it is me. And when something must be sacrificed, well, you can guess where that usually lands. So I smiled at Dad and said, "Sure, I will keep it low-key," and he patted my shoulder with the relieved face of a man who believes he just prevented a natural disaster. And I went back to the crowd trying to be the kind of person who doesn't bristle when people make speeches that pretend the past was harmless and the present is simple, except it never is. Because underneath every neat announcement there are the little details nobody says out loud, like who paid for what, or who apologized privately for something ugly and asked you to never repeat it, or who has a file on their phone full of screenshots and voice notes and late-night messages that would change how people talk to each other if they ever saw the light. The crazy part is that I did not plan anything, and I need you to believe me on that, because if I had planned something, I would have chosen a different day and a different venue and maybe a different target, since I still had that tired, stubborn part of me that wanted to be decent even when other people were not, that little voice saying, "Do not be the person who ruins someone else's night," no matter how many times they shrugged at your pain, because you still believe in fairness even if they do not, and you still want to face yourself in the mirror tomorrow without feeling like you became what they accused you of being. Jenna and I did the obligatory photos and the weird cousin asked about my dating life, like it was a group project I had failed, and Mom hovered the way she does when she wants to keep everyone smiling, which is her way of setting out traffic cones around potential trouble, and for a second I thought maybe we would get through this with nothing worse than sore cheeks and a few comments I would repeat to my therapist, and then I saw him, the fiancé, whose name is Mark, clearing his throat and tapping the side of his glass like someone about to begin a corporate presentation, except there was a tightness around his mouth that didn't match the cheer, something wound up and brittle. The energy of a person who has rehearsed a speech not because he wants to impress people, but because he wants to make sure he doesn't lose his nerve halfway through it. I have a radar for that kind of thing, probably because I have been in rooms where I wasn't allowed to say what I knew, and the urge to speak and the order to stay silent start fighting inside your chest. And from the outside you look perfectly polite while inside you are chewing on a truth that tastes like pennies, and something about Mark's face told me that whatever was coming was not just a toast, but a pivot, a line he would cross that he could not uncross. And I caught a flicker on Jenna's face, the tiniest shift from glowing to guarded, as if she recognized it, too, like a dog hearing a whistle the rest of the room can't hear. Dad moved closer to me and whispered, "Just be gracious," and I almost laughed, because his timing is a kind of art form in itself, always a half step off the beat, and I realized in that moment that I had nothing to say anyway. Because the spotlight was turning without my help, which almost felt like a relief, the kind you don't admit out loud, the kind where you watch a train you did not set in motion, and you realize it is going to arrive whether you push or not, so you keep your hands by your sides, and you let it arrive. Mark raised his glass, thanked everyone, told a short story about how they met that sounded charming in the way these things always sound charming when they are packaged for an audience, and then he swallowed, looked right at Jenna, and said, before the toast, "There's something you all need to know about her," and I swear the noise in the room changed. Not the way writers describe it with dramatic language, just in the simple way a crowd goes from easy to alert, like everyone's breath hit the same pause at once, because even people who love a party also love a secret, and nothing wakes up a room like the promise that someone is about to tell the truth. I felt my phone heavy in my bag, and I felt a memory shift inside me like a book falling open to a marked page, something I did not ask for and did not expect to use tonight. And I watched Jenna's eyes go flat for one beat before she lifted her chin and smiled again, and I knew she recognized the shape of what was coming, even if she didn't know the exact words, because denial makes you sloppy and repetition makes you confident. And when you believe the room will always be managed for you, you stop preparing for the day it will not. I stood there and said nothing, which for me was an act of will, and I promised myself I would not rescue her this time the way I have done 100 times since we were kids, and I let him keep going. Because if there was ever a universe where I did not have to carry the fallout alone, it looked like this one, and as Mark drew a breath that sounded like commitment, Dad squeezed my arm as if to remind me of the script. And I pulled gently away and gave him a look that said, "Not tonight," and then Mark opened his mouth and began the sentence that would rearrange the furniture of our family in a way none of us could quietly fix. Mark took a breath that felt like he had been saving it for weeks, and then he started talking in that careful way people use when they know every word is a match near a gas line, saying that before he made any promises about forever he needed the room to hear something real, because he believed that a marriage should not begin on spin. And for a second I thought he was going to do one of those vague speeches about honesty and growth that sound deep and mean nothing, but he did not blink and he did not do the safe version. He said that the engagement site Jenna shared was not just a cute page with photos and dates and registry links, that tucked at the bottom there was a button for a charity add-on, and that the charity described as a literacy fund in her honor did not lead to a non-profit at all but to a personal account that paid a balance she had described to him as an emergency medical itemized debt, and he had believed her. Because of course he had, until a donor who thought they were contributing to a reading program for kids emailed him asking for a receipt for tax purposes, and he realized there was nothing to receipt and nothing charitable about it. The room did that thing people do when they want to keep smiling in case this is a prank, but their stomach already knows it is not, and I watched Jenna's face run through a whole catalog of expressions in one blink, first confusion, then insult, then the bright smile of someone about to say, "Oh no, you misunderstood," followed by a tiny flinch when she realized he had dates and names and bank statements, and that he was not improvising this for attention, but laying out something he had checked more than once, because checking more than once is what you do when you learn you have been lied to and you are about to be called dramatic for noticing. Dad murmured my name the way a coach calls a timeout, as if I could put the lid back on a pot that had already boiled over, and Mom said Mark's name with a stretch of syllables people use when they hope tone can undo facts. And Jenna cut in with a story about how this was a misunderstanding that got away from her, and how she absolutely meant to transfer the funds to the real charity once the engagement dust settled, and how she had planned a sweet reveal that would make everyone proud. And I watched the crowd lean toward her because people love a softer version. They want the version that lets them go back to their snacks and their jokes. But even the softer version needs air to stand up, and this one had none, because he was holding screenshots of the site builder. The account link, the messages where she told him it would be easier if he just left it alone, all of it spoken in that steady voice that belongs to someone who has decided that being called rude is cheaper than being lied about for the rest of his life. For one stretched moment I felt the old reflex rise in me, the muscle memory of stepping between Jenna and consequences the way I have done since we were teenagers, and she realized tears could be strategy. That tug to make a joke or redirect the conversation or stand up and toast to love to drown out the part nobody wants to hear, but I looked at Dad's hand hovering near my elbow like he was about to guide me into the path he preferred. And I remembered him whispering, "Do not overshadow her," and I thought how convenient it is to call truth overshadowing when what you really mean is do not break the illusion we built around her, and I let the reflex go, because I have spent enough of my life being the human soundproofing for someone else's noise. Mark said he was not canceling the toast or the engagement in that moment, that he wanted her to talk. To say in front of people who love her that the money would be returned and that the description would be corrected, and that the donors who thought they helped children would be given that option for real. And he added that if she could not say it. He did not know what the ring still meant, and I heard two separate gasps, one from Mom and one from a family friend who has never once had her name linked to anything messier than a late thank you note, and I knew the guilt factory would rev its engines in 2 seconds. That Dad would start talking about privacy and bad timing, and how this could have been handled quietly on another day. And that someone would suggest a group hug, because when you do not want to change a pattern you call it healing and move on. Jenna started building a new version on the fly, layering it with phrases like misclick and technical issue and a friend who helped with the site who must have chosen the wrong link, and the more she talked the more airless it felt. Because the words did not match the timeline and the timeline did not match the withdrawals, and she turned to me with that look she saves for emergencies. The one that translates to "you will fix this, because you always fix this," and I let the silence stand between us like a new piece of furniture nobody can ignore. Then I stepped forward, not to rescue her, but to make sure the room did not drift back into soft focus, where hard things dissolve. And I said in a voice that carried without being a shout that I had contributed to that charity add-on myself and that I wanted a receipt as well, which was not a speech and not an attack and not even new information, but it did exactly what needed to happen. Because now it was not just his grievance or a couple of suspicious donors, it was family, it was me, and the people who are wired to protect facades had to decide if they were going to tell me to sit down and hush when I was now standing in the same square with the people they would prefer to keep happy. Dad said my name again with a warning inside it, and I looked at him and asked very calmly whether he was asking me to lie in public, because if he was not asking me to lie, then I would like to hear Jenna say the sentence Mark asked for, which is that the money would be returned immediately and the site would be corrected today, and the donors would be contacted by end of week with the option to redirect or refund. And I watched the room process how specific that sounded and how reasonable it was and how ridiculous it would be to object, and I could feel the tide move a little, because specificity is a broom and half-truths hate clean floors. Jenna's mouth did a small tremble that once would have flipped a switch in me, but I stayed where I was and I kept my hands at my sides and I did not move to hold her up, and after a long few seconds she said she would fix it and apologize and make it right. Except she could not resist the jab. She added that people should understand how stressful this season has been, and that this is the kind of mistake that happens when others push you to do everything perfectly, and the others hung there like a hook waiting for someone gullible enough to bite, and I did not, and neither did Mark, and he nodded like a person who just pulled a thorn he had carried for too long. Here is the part that will sound small on paper, but felt like a wrecking ball in the room, and I need you to understand that this was my first act of revenge, even if it looked like good manners, because when the event manager came by, probably sent by a panicked parent to cut the mic and steer us back to a safe toast, I smiled and asked if she could do me a quick favor and switch the microphone to record into the house system and keep it live for the next minute while Jenna confirmed what she just promised, because guests were asking for clarity and it would help avoid rumors, and the woman, who lives in customer service and likes clean resolution as much as I do, nodded and flipped a setting. So when Jenna repeated her promise, it piped through the speakers and went into the venue's recording just like the couple's first dance would have, which meant it existed somewhere other than my memory and Mark's screenshots, and could not be massaged away tomorrow by a group text about misunderstandings, and that tidy click was the sound of me refusing the role I have always played and choosing a new one that made it impossible to walk this back without tripping over your own words. And the look on Dad's face told me he understood exactly what I had done, even if he would never say it out loud. When the microphones were finally cut and the room broke into those little huddles people form when they want to pretend they are talking about appetizers while they are actually rank ordering blame, Jenna found me with that sharp smile that looks like kindness until you listen to the words underneath it, and she asked in a voice just low enough to pass as restraint whether I had fun, whether I felt big, whether I enjoyed watching her get humiliated on a day that was supposed to be about joy. And I told her I did not enjoy any of this, and that I did not put a single word in Mark's mouth, and that if humiliation showed up tonight it came with her name on the shipping label, which she did not like. So she tried a different door and asked whether I had been feeding him, whether I had sent him anything, whether I had coached him on what to look for, and I said that if he could follow a link and read a bank name then he did not need coaching. But I also said I had donated through that add-on myself and I had the right to ask where my money went, and it was almost funny, the way the word "my" made her nostrils flare, because the story she prefers only works if what is mine is actually hers when she needs it. And what is hers is never mine no matter how empty my hands are. Dad joined us with the tone of a man who thinks volume can stand in for leadership, and he started talking about family and privacy and timing, which is his favorite three-word shield, and Mom kept saying both our names like she was soothing toddlers. And in the middle of that little mess Mark walked over without bluster and said he had called the platform about the account link and they were escalating it to their risk team, which meant any new donations would be held until verification, and I watched Jenna's eyes flash because she finally understood this was not just an awkward conversation, but the kind of mess that leaves footprints in places she cannot reach later, and she turned it on me again, calling me dramatic, saying I always make things bigger. That this would have been nothing if I had not jumped in, and I told her she was mixing up the cause and the cover because the only thing I amplified was the volume knob on honesty, and it is not my fault the song sounded ugly. The people I grew up with started doing what they always do, which is try to turn a problem into a group project with no deadline. So there were suggestions about a statement to friends and maybe a sweet Instagram post about working with a real literacy nonprofit now, which made me want to ask whether they were allergic to the word refund. But I kept my mouth in my pocket and I let the silence clock in, because silence can be useful when the other person is addicted to filling it with excuses. And sure enough, Jenna started floating a new version where she would redirect funds later, and everyone who donated would get a thank you note and a voucher to the wedding registry. And I saw red at the word voucher because that is not accountability. That is a coupon, and people who thought they helped children do not need a discount on a blender. They need their money back, and for once I did not try to make that sentiment palatable. I just said it flat, and a couple of heads turned because sometimes clarity sounds rude if you are used to living in fog. I stepped away from the little circle because I know my own tells, and I could feel my temper starting to fast walk toward a fight that would turn me into the villain in their favorite family story. And I took out my phone and opened my bank app and found the donation line and hit the button that says report an issue, and in the notes I wrote that the payment was solicited under a charitable description that was not accurate. And I attached a screenshot of the add-on page and the venue's audio clip the manager had kindly sent to my email while people were pretending to refill glasses, and I wrote that I wanted the charge reversed and the platform notified of potential misuse. And when I hit submit, I felt that tiny internal click you get when you finally stop begging people to behave, and you put a boundary in a system that does not care about your family dynamics, and I will not pretend it was noble, because revenge felt good in that quiet, clean way where nobody bleeds and nobody gets screamed at, but the rules still reach up and do their job. Mark saw me standing off to the side and asked if I was okay, and I told him I was not, but I was steady, and he said he had emailed the donors who had contacted him and told them he would follow up with a return and a receipt if Jenna did not move quickly, and that he had asked the platform to freeze withdrawals on that link, and I nodded, because I could see a version of him that wanted to still make this work, and I could also see a version that already knew he was done, and I felt that old itch to carry the feelings of the entire room, but I let it pass, and I told him I appreciated that he chose truth over being liked, which earned me a tired smile that said he could finally breathe. Jenna texted me from across the room even though we could still see each other, something about how I should think twice, because I have a career and friends, and this sort of drama can splash, and then she sent that classic line about how family matters should stay inside the house. which always means the person speaking has broken a window and wants you to throw a blanket over it, and I typed back that I was done being a soundproof wall and that I would be sending one clear message to the group. Chat tomorrow morning with the recording attached and 3 simple lines about refunds, corrections, and a real nonprofit option for anyone who still wanted to support reading programs. And I gave her the night to do it herself because I am not a monster and because I believe in the grace of a first chance even when the pattern says I should not, and I told her that if by noon nothing had happened, I would press send. On the way out to my car, Mom caught up to me and did that low voice mothers use when they want to take you back to kindergarten without saying the word, telling me that my sister is under pressure and that I am stronger, and that sometimes the stronger person has to bend so the weaker one does not break. And I heard myself ask her when exactly that bending ends, and when the person who always bends gets to stand up straight, and she did not answer. She just patted my arm and asked me to sleep on it, and I said I would sleep, but I would also act, because I have learned that sleep is not a solution, it is a pause. At home, I opened my laptop and created a simple note addressed to the family group, 3 clear sentences with no adjectives and no heat, just facts and the venue audio file and the platform dispute email attached. And I scheduled it for noon because I wanted to give time for the right thing to happen, and because I also wanted the paper trail to show that I waited. And when I was about to close the lid, a new message popped up from a number I did not recognize with a name I did not expect to see. A woman called Elise who wrote that she did not know me, but she had something I should have seen months ago, and that she had set up the exact same add-on for Jenna last year under a different event, and had been told to keep quiet when she asked about receipts. And that if I was ready to stop being careful, she was ready to talk. And I stared at the screen, feeling the ground tilt in that familiar way, and I wrote back one word that tasted like permission, which was yes. Elise was calm in that way people are when they have been sitting on something heavy for too long, and they are finally done asking for permission to put it down, and as she spoke I felt the slow, unpleasant recognition build in my chest, because every detail she gave me about last year matched the pattern from this year so precisely that it stopped feeling like a slip and started looking like a system, since she described the same add-on link dressed up with the same charity language, the same sweet captions about giving children a chance to read, the same quiet withdrawals that never made it to any nonprofit ledger, and then the messages that followed when she asked for transparency. Those friendly at first, and then firmer notes telling her not to make a fuss, to keep it inside the circle, to remember that attention is fragile and that good people do not tear each other down. Which is the kind of language grifters use when they want you to confuse silence with loyalty and shame with maturity. I asked Elise why she was coming to me now, why she had not gone to Mark directly, and she said she had tried once and backed off because Jenna made her feel crazy about it, and because she did not want to be the reason a relationship blew up, and because she figured time would do the work that courage avoided. But the moment she heard there had been a second round of the same trick under a bigger spotlight, she decided she would not sit in the stands any longer, and she asked whether I wanted copies, and I said I wanted everything. So within a few minutes my screen filled with a clean little archive that included the old add-on page, the transfer confirmations, and a short voice memo from Jenna asking Elise to let it go, because bringing it up now would overshadow something important, a phrase that was starting to feel like a family motto carved into a wall I had finally learned how to walk around. I did not sleep much. Not because I was spiraling, but because my brain was busy doing what it does best when I am done begging for decency, which is building a plan in plain language that does not require anyone's permission. So I made a list of 3 actions that would move this from gossip to structure. First, I would give Jenna one last shot to make it right on her own terms with a short window and obvious steps. Second, I would create a simple path for every donor to request a refund, without having to argue or chase. And third, I would lock the story into places where it could not be erased or softened tomorrow by a "we were tired" post with a pastel background and a heart at the end. By mid-morning, I sent Jenna a straightforward text that said I had documents from someone who gave last year to an identical charity add-on, that I had audio of her promise from last night to refund and correct, and that by noon I would send a message to the full guest list with clear refund instructions and an introduction to a real literacy nonprofit that had agreed, after a quick call, to set up a proper campaign link for anyone who still wanted their gift to do what they believed it would do, and I added that if she sent a clean, verifiable update before noon with proof of refunds in motion, I would attach her statement and give her credit for fixing it fast, which was more generosity than she ever extended when the mess belonged to me. Dad called 5 minutes later with the same sermon about timing and tone, and he tried to fold me back into the old choreography, telling me that leadership means protecting the family from public embarrassment, that this could cost Jenna opportunities and friends and maybe even her job, and I said I had heard all of that for 20 years and that leadership, at least in my world, meant protecting the people outside the family who had been used. And he told me I was being righteous and I told him I was being clear, and we sat there in that old gridlock while the clock moved on without either of us blinking, and then he did the thing he always does at the end of these calls, which is sigh and ask me to think about grace, and I told him I had. And that grace without truth is just polite rot. At 11:50 I opened the draft I had prepared and read it out loud to make sure it landed like a person speaking, not like corporate spin or reality show confessional, and it said, in essence, that the charity add-on was misdescribed and that funds had not gone to a nonprofit, that the link was now locked, that refunds were available immediately through the platform and through a dedicated inbox I had set up where people could forward their donation confirmation and receive a templated claim filed on their behalf, and that a confirmed literacy nonprofit had created a real donation page for anyone who wanted to redirect their gift with proper receipts. And then there was a short audio clip attached of Jenna's promise from last night, because I wanted people to hear it, not to shame her, though I will not pretend that part did not feel gratifying, but to make it impossible to spin this tomorrow as a misunderstanding we invented out of envy. At 11:55 Jenna sent me a long paragraph about betrayal and jealousy and how I have hated her since high school, with a postscript that said, "If you do this you will be dead to me," which was so familiar it landed with no weight. And then Mark texted asking if he could see my message before I sent it, and I wrote that I was not asking for permission, but I was happy to copy him, and he wrote back, "Do it," which told me which version of him had won the argument in his own head, and for a second I felt sad, not because I doubted what I was doing, but because something that could have been decent was being buried by choices that did not have to be made this way, and then my phone buzzed again. A new number with a short video file from Elise showing Jenna earlier this year offering her a registry gift card if she would delete the messages and stop asking about receipts, which was crude and obvious and exactly the kind of bargaining someone attempts when they have run out of plausible stories and are now trading in favors like they are currency that can print more trust. I hit send on the guest list email at noon exactly and watched the little progress bar fill like a quiet drumroll, and, because I believe in redundancy, I also scheduled a second send to the smaller circle of family friends who never read emails the first time. And then I forwarded the same packet to the platform's risk team and to a consumer protection inbox that handles charitable misrepresentation, with a note saying that the recording attached was made with consent and that the donors were adults who deserved clean options, and before anyone could accuse me of doing this for clout, I made sure there was no social post, no public blast, just BCC and documentation and a straight line to a real nonprofit, which meant the people who mattered most would hear from me while the people who love drama would learn secondhand if at all, and that was my revenge, not loud but surgical. Because once that message lived in those inboxes, even the best spin doctor in our family could not unring it without leaving fingerprints. The replies started almost immediately, polite and grateful and a little stunned, and a handful were angrier than I expected, not at me but at the feeling of being played. And I sat with that discomfort, because anger is a fair response to being told your kindness was used as a cash machine, and while those first messages stacked up I saw one more come in that made the room tilt again. A short note from Mark that said he had something I needed to see before the day ended, that it changed the shape of everything, and that he wanted to show it to me in person not because he needed an ally, but because he preferred that there be one witness he trusted when the next decision dropped, and he added one last line that made my heart bang against my ribs, which was that the ring was already off. The last move. By the time I met Mark that evening, I had already watched the first refunds process and seen the real nonprofit's receipt hit my inbox with a simple thank you that felt cleaner than anything our family had managed in years. And I had also fielded 2 calls from relatives who tried to steer me into that old, tired lane where the goal is to minimize damage rather than fix harm. Yet I kept my answers short and factual because I was done narrating feelings for people who were only listening for an angle, and when I walked into the quiet corner of the coffee place where he was waiting, I could tell by his face that whatever he was about to show me was not a plea for sympathy, but a piece of truth he had decided belonged to more than one person. Since he set his phone down, took a breath, and said he had found a folder on Jenna's laptop when she asked him to help transfer files for a brand campaign, a folder that was not tucked away under random names, but sitting there with a label that could not be misread, full of drafts of the add-on pages, screenshots of withdrawals, and a spreadsheet that listed the donors for last year and this year with notes beside certain names about who might be too polite to ask questions. Like generosity was a weakness to be profiled and used. He slid the phone across the table so I could see the recording he had taken while scrolling through the folder with a timestamp clear as day, and then the part that made my throat go hot, which was a set of messages to an assistant Jenna worked with, occasionally spelling out exactly how to set the charity language and what to say if anyone asked for a receipt. The kind of evidence that does not just tell a story of stress or poor choices, but establishes a process, and while I watched, I realized the detail that would matter most to the people who still believed this could be smoothed out, which was that she had a note in there about the venue last night, a line predicting that if anyone raised concerns she would promise a refund and then wait the news cycle out, which is a sentence you cannot defend with tears or a soft post about good intentions. I asked him what he planned to do with it, bracing for a version where he wanted me to carry it alone, and he surprised me by saying he had already taken it to his lawyer because he did not want to be accused later of hacking or snooping, and that the lawyer confirmed the recording of a device he was asked to handle for file transfer would not be a problem, and that the bigger risk here was not his, but Jenna's if she tried to keep playing cute online. And then he said the thing I did not expect, which was that he had talked to his parents and told them he was pulling the plug on the engagement because he refused to walk into a life where the plan was to stage compassion for clicks while using people's kindness like a credit line. Part of me wanted to ask him if he was okay, the reflexive caretaker in me stretching its hand out, and part of me wanted to sit in the simple, hard truth without padding it, so I did the second. I nodded and told him that he was making the only decision that would let him live with himself, and then he asked me whether I wanted a copy of the folder for my records, and I heard how clinical that sounded even as it brought me a weird kind of calm. Because records meant I was not going to spend the next month arguing with people who want to turn facts into opinions, and I said yes, send it, and he did, and then he said there was one more piece he had not planned to tell me but decided I should know, which was that Jenna had told him last week I was jealous and vindictive, and that if pushed I would fake receipts to hurt her, a claim that had wormed its way into his doubts until last night forced him to look at evidence over narratives. And he apologized for believing a version of me she sold him for free, and my eyes stung not because I needed his approval but because being seen without her captions around me felt like air after a long, stale room. While we sat there, my phone began lighting up with replies to the guest email, mostly grateful, a few angry, and then one long message from Dad asking me to meet him before I took things further, which told me he had heard there was more. And right behind it came a brittle paragraph from Jenna saying that if I used anything stolen from her computer, I would be hearing from her lawyer, and I wrote back 2 lines, one telling her that Mark had already handled the legal side and that the platform and consumer protection offices now had everything they needed, and the second reminding her that there was still a door she could walk through where this ended with an apology, full refunds, and a short honest statement that might save her job and her reputation, and that the door was closing fast. And when she sent back a string of insults that made me feel 12 years old again, I muted the thread and took a breath that did not taste like asking permission. The final move was not loud, and it did not need to be cruel to be decisive, because I already had the venue recording, the donor list, Elise's archive, and now Mark's folder. So I drafted a simple update to the same VCC group with 3 attachments that answered every question reasonable people might raise, and I added one new line that changed the stakes without turning me into a tabloid character, which was a short note to brand partners and employers on the list saying that the attached materials had been shared with the platform and consumer protection, that refunds were underway, and that a verified nonprofit link was live for redirecting support, which meant I did not call for Jenna to lose anything. I did not beg anyone to cancel her. I simply placed the truth in the path of the people whose decisions actually shape reputations in our world, and then I clicked send and watched it go, knowing that no one could reasonably call that a smear when every sentence came with a receipt. There is a moment after a hard click where the old fear tries to come back and convince you that you went too far, that you should run to mop up feelings you did not spill, and I felt it, I will not lie about that. But then another message hit my inbox that settled it for me, a short confirmation from the platform that withdrawals on both add-on links were locked, that account owners had been notified of a compliance review, and that donors would be contacted with refund options within the next business day, which meant the cleanup was no longer mine to carry or theirs to spin, and right after that came a message from the real nonprofit sending a list of donors who had already redirected their gifts, with a line thanking whoever created clarity during a confusing situation, which I read twice, because it was the exact opposite of what I am used to hearing in this family when I tell the truth. That night there were a dozen missed calls from my parents and 2 from Jenna that I did not answer, because I did not want to say anything I would regret. And then a final text from Mark with a screenshot of the ring on the counter and a short line that said he hoped we would both find better, and that he was sorry I had to be the one to push the first domino. And even though this is not a love story, and I am not interested in playing the hero in anyone's narrative, I will admit that message sat with me longer than it should have, since it carried the echo of all the times I swallowed truth to keep the table polite, and the simple proof that when you stop doing that, the right people find their own spines. In the morning, the family group chat exploded the way I expected, with accusations and bargaining, and then the predictable pivot to concern for Jenna's mental health, which is a real thing and not a prop, but which also cannot keep being the fire blanket thrown over every pattern. And while they argued with each other, I posted one last message, a quiet closing note that said refunds were moving, documentation had been shared with the correct offices, and that as far as I was concerned the matter was handled. And then I left the chat for the first time since it was created, not because I needed attention, but because I had no interest in playing the role they wrote for me anymore. And when Dad called, I let it go to voicemail, and when he texted, I read it without responding, and I walked into my kitchen and made coffee and felt something unfamiliar settle in, which was the calm that arrives when you stop negotiating with people who only ever asked for your silence, and even if there are still questions and even if there is still fallout, the core is clear, because I did not raise my voice, I did not play dirty, I did not make a scene, I made a record. I drew a line. And for once, the person who learned not to overshadow anyone stepped into her own light and refused to step back. By the time the sun went down on that last day, which I only mention because it gave me a clean edge to the hours, not because I care about drama, I had already learned which relatives would ride the "you went too far" train until the tracks ended, and which friends would quietly Venmo me for coffee with a note that said keep going, and in that space I did what I wish someone had done for me a long time ago, which was write down one page of terms that did not dress itself up as a peace offering or a plea, just a plain list of what an actual repair would look like, starting with a full refund to every donor with proof of transfer, followed by a 2-sentence public statement that admitted misrepresentation without the allergic reaction to the word admit, and then a commitment that any future fundraising by Jenna would go through a real fiscal sponsor with third-party oversight, so no one had to perform trust as a party trick again, and I sent it to her with a short note that said there was A 24-hour window before this left my hands completely, not to threaten her, but to replace our family's endless maybes with a clock. She called me immediately and did the whole performance, the one I could probably lip-sync at this point, where she said that I was being punitive and jealous, that I'd always wanted to cut her down to size, that I was celebrating the fact that her fiancé had left, which I was not, and then she tried the helpless angle where she asked if I could just fix the statement for her and make it sound gentle. And I told her I would make it accurate or I would make it nothing, and she said if I sent anything else to anyone she would make sure I regretted it, which told me we were finally talking without masks, because threat is the first language of someone who has run out of versions that make them look good. And I said that I hoped she would choose the easy door, but that I had already prepared the hard one, and I ended the call because I am done participating in conversations that wander in circles hoping I will give up out of exhaustion. Here is where people start to disagree with me, and I am fine with that, because I know I pushed, and I know it will read harsh to anyone who has never had to choose between clean truth and polite rot. But what I did next was the last move in a plan I did not even know I was building until the pieces were on the table, since I printed those terms on letterhead, had them notarized, and attached them to a packet with the platform's compliance case number, the venue recording, Elise's archive, and the annotated screenshots from Mark's folder, and I sent that packet by certified mail and email to 3 places that do not care about family feelings: the Consumer Protection Division, already holding the file, the platform's legal desk, and Jenna's employer's ethics officer, because I am done with the performance of accountability that never touches the parts of life that actually make people behave, and I kept the cover note so brisk you could skate on it, just a clear statement that funds were being returned, that documentation was enclosed, and that any statement claiming confusion would be contradicted by the materials attached, which meant there was no whiplash between what I knew and what I did, and no soft landing where this shrank to gossip we could drink away. When Dad called again, I let it roll to voicemail, and then I listened to him say the words I had been waiting my whole life to hear and dreaded in equal measure, which were that I had embarrassed the family, that people were talking, that this could have been managed. And I saved it because sometimes you keep a record not to win an argument, but to remind your later self that you did not imagine the part where the people who needed protection most were never the ones getting it. And while I sat there with my phone face down and my hands steady, the email I knew was coming arrived from Jenna with a statement attached that was half apology and half press release, the kind of thing that thinks passive voice is a friend, and I wrote back with the terms again and a clock. And I also told her what I had decided to do even if she complied, which was to set up a small donor-advised fund seeded by redirected refunds, named without her name at all, with a board that did not include anyone related to me, because I am not interested in being a new version of the same problem. Noon the next day came and went, and even though refunds were already moving, she had not posted the statement and she had not signed the terms, and I could feel the old instinct to buy more time creeping up my spine. That tired reflex to stall and soften and call it grace, and I told myself out loud that a deadline is not an act of cruelty when it protects people who were used. And then I walked to the mailbox like a normal person and sent the certified packets I had prepared, not because I wanted to destroy her, but because I wanted the story to exist somewhere my parents could not stand down with a family dinner and a collective memory loss, and a few hours later the first copy landed where it mattered. Because the platform's legal team responded with a formal note that the links were under review, that withdrawals were frozen pending resolution, and that the account owner had been notified of policy actions that might include permanent restrictions, which is bureaucratic for consequences, and I stared at the screen and felt absolutely nothing theatrical, just that quiet click again in my chest, the one that says, "You closed the loop." In the evening, Mom texted something that almost got me, a soft little paragraph about sisters and forgiveness, and how it is lonely out there when you decide you do not need anyone, and I wrote back that I do need people. Just not the version of people who ask for my silence and call it love, and I told her I would always pick up for her if she wanted to talk to me like a woman instead of a mediator. And then I muted the chat again, because I am learning that I do not have to keep walking into Rooms where the only chair reserved for me is the one with the duct tape over the mouth rest, and I made dinner, and I checked the refund inbox. And I wrote 3 more thank you notes to donors who had rerouted their gifts to the real nonprofit and were kind enough to say they respected the way I handled it, and I slept that night without bargaining with ghosts. The day after that, Jenna posted the real statement, the one that used the word misrepresented without choking on it, the one that linked to the refund process and the verified nonprofit. The one that said she was stepping back from brand work and taking ethics training as a condition of her employment, which I know landed only because the ethics officer wrote to me separately and confirmed receipt of the packet and the terms. And I did not dance around the kitchen or screenshot it to friends. I just added it to the folder and sent one last 2-sentence update to the guest list saying refunds were moving, receipts were available, and the story was closed on my end, which is the cleanest revenge I know. Not the showy kind that begs for applause, but the firm kind that settles into the bones of a family and changes the way people step around you from then on, because you drew a line and you did not let anyone turn it into a suggestion. There will be people who say I ruined an engagement and torched a bridge, and maybe they are right, but here is the part they do not have to live with and I do, which is that for the first time since I can remember I did not perform the role I was assigned. I did not step between consequences and the person who earned them, I did not flinch when the room went cold, and I did not accept a version of love that requires me to disappear to keep others comfortable, and whether Jenna ever sits across from me again without spitting fire is not the point anymore, because the point is that I put the truth where it could not be moved. I protected people who were used. I made sure the right offices had what they needed, and I walked away, not furious, not smug. Just finished, which is a new word for me, and it feels like a door that opens onto a life where I am not the one told to stand in the corner in case my happiness blocks the view.